Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be back with you. I know I've been away for a little while, but hopefully we're going to get back on track. And today we're going to be in session 4 of our quarterly on page 37, and it's titled Divided. Now, if you've been in the First Kings and read anything in First Kings, you can see what Solomon did up to a period of time, and then you can see that he kind of drifted away from the Lord by following the many wives that he had. He started following their practices and stuff, and it kind of led him away from the Lord. Now, we're going to pick up and see what the Lord has told Solomon before he died, what was going to happen to the kingdom. So, and that's what the story pretty much is going to be about today. But it is called Divided. And you know, when I think of that, it seems to me like it brings back memories of my childhood. You know, most of us have received advice that we wish that we had followed. I know many a time my parents told me, don't do that. You'll be sorry if you do that. Don't even do that. And I used to think that they were kind of crazy. You know, I thought, man, they don't know what they're talking about. But in the end, as I grew older, I understood that what they said was actually very good advice. Now, we're going to see that Solomon's son sought advice from two different groups of people, and we're going to see what happens when he did that. So we're going to know that Rehoboam made a significant decision based on some advice that appeared to his ego, and it cost him. So let's give a little bit of understanding the context here. Now we know Solomon disobeyed God by worshiping the pagan gods of his many foreign wives. And this was in spite of the Lord talking to him twice and instructing him to walk in obedience. Well, God spoke to him a third time and said that because of your adulterous practices, most of the kingdom would be given to Solomon's servant and would be stripped away from his family, all except for one part of the kingdom. So, at one part of the kingdom, Solomon's son would rule over Judea. And Jeroboam is the young man whose building skills impressed Solomon, and that's who got the other 10 parts of the kingdom. Was Jeroboam. So let's look at this, and we're going to see at some point Jeroboam met a prophet called Ahiah outside of Jerusalem. Now the prophet removed his outer cloak and tore it into 12 pieces, and he handed 10 pieces to Jeroboam and explained that the Lord had said, I will take the 10 tribes of the kingdom from Solomon and Solomon's son, give them to you, and you will be king over Israel. Now, still speaking to Ahijah, the Lord promised Jeroboam a lasting dynasty just as he had built for David, if Jeroboam would keep God's statutes and commands. So God was going to give 10 tribes of the kingdom of Israel to Jeroboam, and that left only 2 tribes to his son Rehoboam. Jeroboam, Solomon's servant, did indeed rule the northern kingdom after Solomon died. Now this territory retained the name Israel. Now Solomon's son Rehoboam ruled over the southern parts of the kingdom, thereafter called Judea. Because of God's promise to David, Jerusalem would remain the capital city, not of Israel, but of Judea. Now we kind of know who the new leaders of the 2 kingdoms are now. And we know the northern and southern kingdoms, and we know when that they became rulers, and that was after Solomon died. Now the question is, how would these men rule over their respective nations? So let's go in and start reading verses 6 through 7. And it says, Then King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon when he was alive, asking, How do you advise me to respond to this people? They replied, Today, if you will be a servant to this people and serve them, and if you respond to them by speaking kind words to them, they will be your servant forever. So the Israelites had gathered at Shechem for the coronation of Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and the heir apparent to the throne. Now, with Jeroboam serving as spokesman, the people asked Rehoboam to lighten their workload and relieve them of the harsh conditions they endured under Solomon. Now, believe this or not, Solomon was kind of a hard ruler. He was a hard taskmaster. In order to do all the building projects that he was doing in Israel and Jerusalem at the time, he had to use forced labor. So keep that in mind. So they asked his son if he would lighten their load. And they said that we were promised we will serve you. So Rehoboam sent them away for 3 days, supposedly so he could ponder his decision. Now, Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father. And it says that the elders being present at that temple dedication when the king brought the Ark of the Covenant into the most holy places, also called the Holy of Holies. So these men were with Solomon a long time, especially some of them were there when the temple was dedicated. So these were wise men who had followed and been in Solomon's court for many years. So we see that Rehoboam had consulted them to find out what they would say. Now this is the advice that they offered Rehoboam. First, they offered him a twofold advice. First, that he should be a servant and serve. Secondly, he should respond with kind words. Now, it's not insignificant that Rehoboam was in Shechem for his coronation, and is also there when he heard the people's complaint and request. Shechem was north of Jerusalem and had been significant in Israel's ancient history, so it's not a light matter that he was there. See, some biblical scholars believe that people in the northern parts of Israel had grown weary of contributing to the workforce, the forced labor that is, that mainly the work was done in Jerusalem and Judea. They were tired of being taxed for the upkeep of the temple and royal court. The elders may have sensed the people up north were already feeling alienated and were experiencing taxation without representation. And we've heard that in our own time. So they advised Rehoboam to be a servant and to serve and to speak kindly. And the elders knew this would go a long way in building bridges with the people of the north. Now the elders offered a timetable. If you will do this today, the people will serve you forever. Now, when you read this, you might wonder that maybe these elders likely wanted to make sure Israel would retain its glory days and that servants would always be plenteous. The elders had seen good things Solomon accomplished and wanted it to continue. So they advised him, if you will offer this kind of response, the splendor of Israel will continue indefinitely. So let's see what Rehoboam did next. See, it says in verse 8 to 15, but he rejected the advice of the elders who advised him and consulted with young men who had grown up with him and attended him. He asked him, what message do you advise that we send back to this people who said to me, lighten the yoke your father put upon us? The young men who had grown up with him told him, this is what you should say to this people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. This is what you should tell them. My little finger is thicker than my father's wrist. Now let's stop right there and talk about those 3 verses right there. So we see Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders. See, he was unwilling to serve or to be a servant. Rehoboam consulted young men instead of listening to the words of the elder. And you see, these young men had a history with him. They was probably brought up in the palace, was probably his play palace. So they knew how Rehoboam was, so they were speaking to what he wanted to hear. See, Rehoboam may have been immature, but he was certainly no child. He was 41 years old when Solomon died, so he was a He was a grown man. Now, these young men attended Rehoboam. This indicates that they had experienced life in the palace, and they evidently wanted to maintain their status. Being raised with Rehoboam, they would have known what he wanted to hear, and that's what they were telling him, exactly what he wanted to hear. Now, you can almost hear the young man mocking the people who had asked Rehoboam to make their yokes lighter. To say, this is what you should say to the people, reeks of contempt. So the young advisors presented 3-word pictures. The first compared Rehoboam's little finger to his father's wrist. The second involved making the people's yoke, meaning the burden of their work, even heavier. And the third was a threat to beat the complainers with wired whips instead of the regular whips. See, these young counselors reminded Rehoboam that Solomon had used these whips when he disciplined people. Of the 3-word picture, only the one involving the heavy yoke directly addressed the people's request. Rehoboam's elder advisors had encouraged the new king to listen to the people and to respond with the kindness of a servant's heart. In contrast, Rehoboam's contemporaries spoke from a place of self-serving entitlements and encouraged him to intimidate the complainers with threats of even greater difficulties. Now it was foolish of Rehoboam to listen to the young man instead of to the elders. If he maybe had listed them, it's no telling how far the kingdom of Israel would have lasted in peace and prosperity. Let's look at verses 12 through 15 now. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the 3rd day as the king had ordered. Return to me on the 3rd day. Then the king answered the people harshly. He rejected the advice the elders had given him and spoke to them according to the young man's advice. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed wire whips. The king did not listen to the people because this turn of events came from the Lord to carry out his word, which the Lord has spoken through Ahijah, this Zilonite, to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. So let's look a little closer at verses 12 through 15. We see that when the people returned on the 3rd day, Rehoboam answered them harshly. He repeated what the young men had said. Now, he said, you are familiar with what my father did, but I would do even worse. By repeating the young man's advice, Rehoboam revealed none of his own thoughts. Had he nothing to contribute to the situation? Not a thing. He made plain he had sought the advice of the elders of his contemporaries. The next thing gives no indication Rehoboam had sought the Lord's counsel or guidance. There's none of that in there. So the king did not listen to the people. Now the writer here explained that this fulfilled the prophecy Ahijah had spoken to Jeroboam in 1 Kings chapter 11, 29 through 37. Let's look at verses 16 through 19 and see how all this is going to tie in together and how the kingdom fares after it has been split. When all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people answered him, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Israel, return to your tents. David, now look after your own house. So Israel went to their own tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites living in the cities of Judea. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam managed to get into the chariot and flee to Jerusalem. Israel is still in rebellion against the house of David today. See, verse 16 repeats the indictment against Rehoboam. He had not listened to the people. And the Israelites realized their voices had not been heard and were offended. They made sure, though, that their voices were about to be heard, they answered him, "What portion do we have in David?" Now, decades earlier, a rift occurred between the northern and southern parts of Israel. A man called Sheba, a man from the northern territory of Benjamin, helped lead a rebellion against King David. Rallying the 10 tribal territories of Israel against the king, Sheba shouted, "We have no portion in David, no inheritance in Jesse's son. Each man to his own tent, Israel." And that's in 2 Samuel chapter 20, verse 1. Some believe that Sheba's declaration served as a rallying cry for the northern tribes for some time. Sheba's words were the response that the people of Shechem gave to Rehoboam. To Sheba's cry, they added, "David, now look after your own house." What had happened when Sheba rallied the people in his day? So all the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba. What happened after the people gave their answer to Rehoboam? So Israel went to their tents. Rehoboam destroyed in a matter of days what Saul, David, and Solomon had taken 120 years to build. In one day he destroyed a kingdom. Although he had wanted to rule over the glorious kingdom he inherited, Rehoboam ruled over only those who lived in the city of Judea. See, Rehoboam was not content to leave the situation as it was. He sent Adoram to talk to the people who had broken away. See, Adoram had overseen the forced labor for King Solomon. When Rehoboam was attempting reconciliation or merely continuing as if nothing had changed, sending Adoram proved tragic. The Israelites stoned him to death. Sensing danger himself, Rehoboam mounted his chariots and fled to Jerusalem. The once thriving kingdom was divided. Jeroboam became king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam ruled Judea. Now the two kings were at war throughout their reigns. Neither kingdom ever achieved the glory or the strength that Israel had in Solomon's day. Although Rehoboam did experience some success, his reputation remained tarnished on account of what he'd done. The final analysis was that Rehoboam did what was evil because he did not determine in his heart to seek the Lord. You see, wise leaders seek the counsel of experienced advisors before making important decisions. That's the way it was in all the kings of Israel. Arrogant counsel leads to self-serving decisions, and self-serving decisions cause painful divisions. And that's true for us today in our own leadership. We need experienced advisors advising the president, the prime minister, or whatever the title may be. If they fail to heed wise counsel, things get pretty messy, just as he was doing with Jeroboam and Rehoboam. I hope you all enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you have a blessed day from Brother Tony and I. Thank you, and hopefully we'll see you Sunday in church. Bye-bye.